we turn to the book of 1 Kings, and we're going to look at his passing. What are the final things that David says to his son? So turn with me to page 263 if you're reading from one of the Bibles there in the pew. 1 Kings chapter 1, again, that is page 263. In 1 Kings chapter 1, David is now a very old, elderly person who is, at this point, hours, if maybe days, away from his passing. And we read this in chapter 1, verse 1. When King David was very old, he could not keep warm when they put covers over him. I don't know if anyone can identify with that in this cold weather, that you need more covers, or maybe you need some sort of a heating pad or something like that. David's body is aging. It's breaking down. He can't keep his internal temperature anymore. And what will they do? Will they warm up his room, maybe a bigger fire, maybe a hot water bottle or something like that? No, they come up with a solution to help the aging king stay warm, and it is a bit surprising. Then again, as we look back over David's life and some of his vices, maybe it's not so surprising. Look at verse 2. So his attendants said to him, "Let us look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him. She can lie beside him so that our lord the king may keep warm." What do you think about that idea? David is an old man, and as we've learned from his stories, he actually had a wife. In fact, in that ancient culture, he had multiple wives. But they propose, his servants propose, that a young virgin will care for him. And that care will include laying beside him to keep him warm. It kind of sounds a little bit strange, doesn't it? It does not seem that this is a God-honoring idea. And we've seen in the past that one of David's vices, one of his struggles, is with women and the mistreatment of women. And as a result, he ended up with many wives and so on. And maybe that's why his attendants thought this was an okay idea. We just don't know. Well, let's see what happens. Look at verse 3. Then they searched throughout Israel for a beautiful young woman and found Abishag, the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. Now here's a young woman, Abishag. She's going to serve the elderly king by keeping him warm. No doubt it would be considered a great honor to serve the king. But if you're this young woman, would you want to do this? How would you feel? Would you be thinking, oh, this is a great honor. I definitely want to do this. Now, it's possible that her selection was essentially the same as her family winning the lottery. Maybe her parents would be saying to her, oh, of course you're going to go serve the king, and you're going to even keep him warm because this is going to pay off for our family in the long run. To have that kind of access to the most important person in the land, think about the access and the possibility that this might serve our family beneficially, financially, and so on. Her parents could easily be saying to her, you go. This is a golden ticket. Now, I did wonder, did you notice there in verse 3, they search for a beautiful woman? Why the beauty requirement? Did David's attendants assume that if a young woman was going to keep the elderly king warm, that she better be outwardly beautiful too? Think about it. When David was chosen to be king, God said this, humans look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And now David's attendants are betraying that principle. They're emphasizing outward appearance. It doesn't seem right. So what we're hearing is that for this elderly king and this young woman, this is a really bizarre situation. But Abishag is selected, and this is what we read in verse 4. The woman was very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him. But the king had no sexual relations with her. So David handled this situation honorably. And yet I have to ask, why are we hearing about this story? Why does this author want to tell us this story about this moment in David's life here at the end? Well, it seems like he's setting the stage for us. He wants us to realize that David is basically on his deathbed. And the fact that the king, who has been king for decades, is on his deathbed leads to a national crisis. I'm going to summarize a little bit because the chapter is long and we actually need to get into the next chapter as well to get to the conclusion of our story today. And what we read in verse 5 is that one of David's sons, and this would have been his eldest son at this point, Adonijah, he steps forward to become the next king. Adonijah basically is saying, my dad is on his deathbed. The old king can't be king anymore. I am next in line. I get to be king. And so, all sorts of people in the royal family and military personnel begin to take sides. Some of them agree with Adonijah. Some of them agree that he's the eldest. He should become king. Some do not agree with this. And here's a summary of the story. Adonijah gathers together a party of his supporters. They're having a great party. They're sacrificing and animals and barbecuing, and they're just having a great time. He invites a whole bunch of the royal family members and other officials. Adonijah also snubs a few people. Here are the famous people he does not invite to his party. Number one, the prophet Nathan, who is David's trusted advisor. Number two, the powerful soldier Benaiah. Remember him? We met him a few weeks ago. He was one of David's so-called mighty men. Benaiah was the guy who jumped down into a pit where a lion had been trapped on a snowy day. That guy. Adonijah says, no, he can't come. And finally, Adonijah says, Solomon can't come, his younger brother. And that's an important snub. So these three people, powerful people in the land, they are not invited to this feast. Well, the prophet Nathan, he's one of the guys that was not invited. He's David's most trusted advisor. Nathan goes to Solomon's mother. Remember her? Bathsheba. And he says, have you heard that Adonijah has made a move to become king? And Nathan advises Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, you better go to the current king, David, and tell him what's happening. And Bathsheba does that. Bathsheba goes right to the room where this beautiful young woman, Abishag, is attending David on his deathbed. I mean, this is quite a scene. If we take into scope the entire story of the life of David, this once vibrant king is now old and aged and nearly dead. The once young and beautiful Bathsheba, who is one of David's wives, enters the room. This is Bathsheba, who David had committed perhaps his greatest sin with. Remember, he lusted after her. He likely raped her. And eventually she became his wife after David killed her husband. I know, I'm sharing a lot of drama today, right? As we think back over all of these stories of the life of David. Well, decades have passed. And now a different young, beautiful woman is there in the room with David as Bathsheba walks in. We need to remember the power dynamics of this society. David might be old and dying, but he still has all the power in the room right now. He has a new, beautiful young maiden attending him. And there comes Bathsheba, his old wife. She does not have power in this situation. If David perceives the slightest impropriety in Bathsheba coming to talk with him, he could easily throw her out of the room. And he's about to die, remember? He's got nothing to lose in this moment. It's Bathsheba who has everything to lose. She could lose her position in the royal household, and that would affect the fate of her son Solomon. And worse yet, if this guy Adonijah, David's oldest son, truly does become king, guess who suddenly gets in the crosshairs of Adonijah's power-hungry emotions? Bathsheba and her son Solomon. Because when a new king comes to the throne in that ancient culture, they will often want to purge any contenders to the throne. Adonijah could easily say, Bathsheba needs to die, Solomon needs to die, because I don't want anyone to take over the throne. So does Bathsheba, David's old wife, the old beautiful one, does she have any power left, even the slightest political capital, to maybe speak to David in this last moment on behalf of her son? How's this going to go down? Look at verse 16. Bathsheba bowed down, prostrating herself before the king. What is it you want? The king asked. She said to him, My lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it. He has sacrificed great numbers of cattle, calves, and sheep, and has invited all the king's son, Abiathar the priest, and Joab, the commander of the army, but he has not invited Solomon your servant. My lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, to learn from you who will sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise, as soon as my lord the king is laid to rest with his ancestors, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals. She's right. But David, thankfully, is receptive to Bathsheba. Now, it does appear that David has no idea of this information that Bathsheba has just divulged to him. This whole party that Adonijah has started in order to become king. And Bathsheba reminds David, David, you promised me years ago that it would be my son, Solomon, who would become the next king. How's David going to react? He's on his deathbed. Does he even care anymore? Is he too old to even worry about all of this drama? Well, in verse 22, suddenly another visitor arrives. It says, while she, Bathsheba, was still speaking to the king, Nathan the prophet arrived. Remember him. Nathan is David's most trusted advisor. I wonder if they coordinated this. Nathan and Bathsheba. Remember, they had talked a little bit earlier. It was Nathan who went to Bathsheba and said, hey, you need to get in there to the king, because this other guy, Adonijah, the older son, is starting to try and become king, and not your son Solomon. You need to go in there to David and talk with him. But think about this cast of characters. There in the room, Nathan, Bathsheba, David. This is a total throwback to decades earlier in that other story that I already mentioned that featured Nathan and Bathsheba and David. When David had sinned with Bathsheba, and it was Nathan who confronted David and said, David, you have sinned. I wonder if Nathan and Bathsheba separately orchestrated this moment now, decades later in the old king's life, because maybe, even if subconsciously, they want to create a link in David's heart and mind to that other time when the three of them were together. when Nathan confronted David about his sin. Now, in the years since, this is decades ago, we have heard hardly anything about Bathsheba and her son Solomon, other than they lived in the royal household. And when you live in the royal palace, life is pretty good, right? It's cushy. We know that Nathan and David remained close for his entire life. David trusts Nathan. And when Nathan enters the room, if you peek ahead to verse 28, it's clear that at that moment Bathsheba leaves the room. And in verse 23, Nathan bows down before David and he confirms everything that Bathsheba has said. Nathan uses a little bit of a different tactic, though. He's not just divulging information, he's asking the king questions. Did my lord the king authorize Adonijah to become the next king? If so, how come none of your servants were made aware of this? Nathan's asking really wise questions here. Questions that get to the heart of David's authority, because David actually is still the king. He's on his deathbed, but he does have the authority unless Adonijah, his oldest son, is going to come and try and take the kingdom by force, which would require Adonijah to kill David. But so far, Adonijah has not attempted that kind of drastic action. Instead, Adonijah is just throwing this feast, this party, and trying to gain public support for his bid to become king. But Adonijah, now Nathan and Bathsheba have shared David. Adonijah is doing this all behind David's back, without David's authority, without David's approval. What will David do? Well, in verses 28 through 30, we read, David makes a decision. Then King David said, "Call in Bathsheba." She came back into the king's presence and stood before him. The king then took an oath. "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." And so, in the next few verses, verses 31 through 37, we read that David sets those details in motion for the official transfer of power. He wastes no time, and he keeps his word to Bathsheba. And then in verse 38, we read this. "So Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada," that's the in the pit with a lion on a snowy day guy, "the Kerethites and Pelethites went down and had Solomon mount King David's mule, and they escorted him to Gihon." Now, these are all details right there within the city of Jerusalem that will make Solomon king. Verse 39, "Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, 'Long live King Solomon!' And all the people went up after him, playing pipes and rejoicing greatly, so that the ground shook with sound." And just like that, in a matter of moments, Solomon is king of Israel. But what about the other guy, Adonijah? The other guy who's having this big feast and this big party because he's thinking he's going to become king. Look at verse 41. "Adonijah and all the guests who were with him heard it." They heard the sound of Solomon becoming king as they were finishing their feast. On hearing the sound of the trumpet, Joab asked. Now, Joab was David's longtime military commander who has now thrown in his lot with Adonijah. Joab asked, "What's the meaning of all the noise in the city?" So do you see what's happening in Jerusalem? Like basically just around the block from each other are these simultaneous competing parties to celebrate the crowning of the new king. And the noise from Adonijah's party is getting drowned out by the much, much louder noise of Solomon's party. In verses 42 through 45, I'll just summarize. Messengers come to Adonijah and inform him, you got some serious competition to the throne, buddy. And it's real bad news. Look what the messengers say in verses 46 through 48. They say this to Adonijah, Solomon has taken his seat on the royal throne. Also, the royal officials have come to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, may your God make Solomon's name more famous than yours, and his throne greater than yours. And the king bowed in worship on his bed and said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has allowed my eyes to see a successor on my throne today. Suddenly, for Adonijah, his situation and his own little party there, his own little desire to become king, has gone 180 degrees in the other direction, and he is in big trouble. You ever have one of those moments when you can remember that you got found out? You got caught. You think you've cheated the system. You think you've gotten away with a lie. Maybe it was a little crime. Maybe it was something on your taxes. Maybe it was something you cheated at work. And you're thinking, I got away with this. Nobody knows. And I'm free. And then out of nowhere, something happens and your indiscretion is revealed. In an instant, your emotions shift from that thrill of victory and freedom to total despair of defeat. That's Adonijah in this moment. And it's not just him. He had invited a whole bunch of people to his party, and they had thrown their support to him. Those people chose not to get verification first. They chose not to get verification that Adonijah actually had the authority to become king. Now they realized that they, along with Adonijah, could be construed as traitors, as wicked people who are trying to undermine the authority of both the old king and the new king. It's bad for them in this moment. Real bad. Look at verse 49. The guests are incredibly afraid at this moment. And they leave Adonijah's party as fast as they can. It's almost like that scene where you hear about high schoolers having a drinking party, and someone says, the police showed up, let's get out of here. And people are jumping out windows, out back doors, scrambling through the bushes, getting all cut up because they're afraid they're going to get caught. But what about Adonijah? In verse 50, we read that Adonijah believes Solomon, who as king is now in charge of the military, is going to have Adonijah killed. And his fear there, his belief, is well-founded. Solomon could easily do that. Just as Bathsheba was afraid that if Adonijah became king, Bathsheba and Solomon would be killed. Well, now the tables have turned. Solomon is king, and Adonijah should be afraid that he's going to get killed. And so Adonijah goes to the tent where the altar was, God's altar, and he grabs it and plants himself on the altar, thinking there's no way Solomon is going to kill me on an altar that is meant for religious purposes. Adonijah is thinking, I've got the perfect escape plan here by attaching myself to the altar. So in verses 51 and 52, Solomon actually agrees. And he tells Adonijah, you're free to go if you behave properly. I'll let you live. But if you try anything, try any games, if you try to change your mind and become king or do any wickedness, you will die. And with that warning, Solomon sends Adonijah home. And it's over. And that brings us to chapter 2. And David's final words to his son. I want to read the most important part of David's charge to his son Solomon, who is now king. He says this, "I am about to go the way of all the earth. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me." And now he quotes the Lord there in verse 4. The Lord had said to David, "If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel." And that's the heart of the passage. Now hold that thought. We're going to come back to that in a moment, because we need to tie up some loose ends in the story of David. David has a few more words to say to his son in verses 5 through 9, in that final, last words of David. Basically, they are some instructions about dealing with people in David's life. Some of them were difficult people, some of them were wonderful people. And essentially, he says, Solomon, you need to deal with the difficult people, and you need to bless the wonderful people. And then in verses 10 and 11, we read this. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. And the remainder of 1 Kings chapter 2 describes how Solomon established his throne. First, we learn a little bit more about that guy Adonijah. He was the one who was trying to become king. He was Solomon's older brother. And we learn that Adonijah goes to Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, and says, "Hey Bathsheba, can you go ask Solomon if I'm allowed to marry Abishag?" Remember her? She was the beautiful young woman who took care of David on his deathbed. Adonijah thinks she's beautiful. I'm not sure what else he's thinking. We're going to hear a little bit more in just a moment. But he wants to marry her. But he doesn't feel like he can go to Solomon and ask. Maybe he thinks, I just don't have standing with Solomon. I'm kind of on the outs with him. But his mom, maybe I can get his mom to go ask for me, because Solomon respects his mom. Bathsheba agrees. She goes and asks Solomon if Adonijah can have Abishag as his wife. How do you think Solomon should answer his mom? It's a beautiful young woman who helped take care of their dad. Solomon is the king now. He definitely has the authority to make the choices about what happens as far as relationships go in the royal household. Maybe if he allows Abishag to become the new wife of Adonijah, it's kind of like a peace offering, since things were pretty rough there between Solomon and his older brother. So what do you think Solomon says to his mom about this request? He says, absolutely not. And in fact, he basically says to Bathsheba, I can't believe you're even asking me this. Why? Why is he so forceful about this situation? Why is he viewing Adonijah's request so negatively? It's because Solomon views this request as a subversive act. First, Adonijah is older than Solomon. Remember that? Culturally speaking, and this is still the case in many monarchies around the world, the oldest has the right to the throne. Second, since Abishag had been in King David's service, it's essentially the same as saying that Abishag was like one of David's concubines, like that second-tier wife. So if Adonijah marries her, Adonijah is marrying the former king's concubine. When you put those two ideas together, Adonijah's birth order, he's the oldest, and marriage to David's concubine, Solomon believes that Adonijah would have a powerful rationale to claim that he, Adonijah, was the rightful king, even though David had made Solomon king. Well, David's dead and gone. Solomon believes that if he allows this marriage to happen, it could lead to political turmoil, perhaps even military battle. And he just says, no way, never. Solomon makes it very clear. He basically says, Adonijah is essentially challenging my claim to the throne. By the way, I told Adonijah, if he ever tried anything like this, he would have to die. This is wicked. This request is wrong. He must die. And Solomon has Benaiah, the guy who jumped in the pit with the lion on a snowy day, to go kill Adonijah. And he does. And then Solomon deals with the people that David, his father, told him to deal with. He removes one of the priests who was disloyal. He has Benaiah enact capital punishment on the former military general and some others. And Solomon establishes his throne securely. Now let's go back to those final words. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Let me read it again. David says, I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. This week, Chris and I started discussing a book together. And in that book, I learned of some far less famous last words. What we read there in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, are King David's last words. Well, in this book that Chris and I are reading, the author is a Christian scholar and a spiritual writer named Dallas Willard. He passed away somewhere in the vicinity of 10 years ago. And numerous contemporary Christians believe that Dallas Willard's writings are going to have a significant impact, in a very positive sense, on Christianity for decades to come. In fact, I encourage you to go to the elective class that Kirk Marks is teaching, because he's using one of Dallas Willard's books. It's just really excellent writer. Well, his family and his estate recently published posthumously some teaching that Dallas Willard did in the 1980s. And it's all about the parables of Jesus. This book just came out a couple months ago. And in the introduction, they recall Dallas Willard's last words to some of his family members just before he died. Let me ask you this. What would your last words be to your family members? A lot of people would probably say, I love you. I've always loved you. Those are famous last words. Some people, when they're on their deathbed, might say, go make things right with such and such a person if there's been a brokenness. But what would you want your last words to be? What would you want to be remembered for saying to those people that love you, that are surrounding you? Because those last words are going to be locked in their hearts and minds. They won't forget them. Your last words might have a profound impact on your children, on your grandchildren, on your friends. What should we disciples of Jesus say as our last words? You know what Dallas Willard said? Give them heaven. I love that. It's a play on the phrase that is much more common. Give them hell. Right? We hear that in our culture. It's kind of like a military word, or sometimes in sports, or film. Every now and then you hear that in the movies. The idea of that phrase is to encourage people to give their all to the task. And there's kind of a tone of violence associated with it because of the word hell, right? But Willard so creatively and ingeniously removes the violence. He removes the fire and death, and he brings new life to that phrase. When we think about our mission as disciples of Jesus, those three words say it so well. Give them heaven. Just as David told Solomon to walk in obedience to God, to keep God's decrees, to live faithfully according to God, we disciples of Jesus live the principles and mission of the kingdom of heaven in our daily lives. That's how we give them heaven. In other words, when you and I live in line with God's heart, when you and I live in line with the way that Jesus lived his life, we give the people around us a foretaste of the kingdom of heaven. It's not the same thing as the totality of the kingdom of heaven, but it's a wonderful taste if we live that way. That's why we've been emphasizing the fruit of the Spirit, just like you heard Eric share about love this morning. The fruit of the Spirit, we read, is love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control. Can you imagine the impact Christians would have in our world if we are known primarily for how our love is like Jesus' love? Now, when I say that, if we would live like Jesus' love, I'm not suggesting we have to be perfect like he was. I'm not suggesting that if we're not perfect, somehow we failed. Not at all. Living like Jesus is the goal. But God's grace is always a part of our lives, knowing that we don't have to be 100% like Jesus or else failure. But don't let imperfection stop you from pursuing that goal. Next month, we're going to be talking about the fruit of the Spirit, joy. And the month after that, there'll be another one. And I asked the same question. Can you imagine if Christians were known for our joy? Could you imagine if Christians were known for our peace? If Christians were known for our patience and goodness and gentleness? David's charge to Solomon is all about a way of living. David is saying that a particular way of living leads to prosperity. This is not something that people have called the prosperity gospel. Maybe you've heard that. The prosperity gospel suggests that if people just have enough faith, and if they have enough trust and obedience in God, then God is going to make everything wonderful in their lives. It's sometimes called the health and wealth gospel because those people say that if we live with enough faith and obedience, we're going to be healthy and wealthy and wise. Like it's a guarantee. It's not a guarantee. In our theological tradition, in our church tradition, we disagree that the Bible teaches that prosperity is a guarantee for those who are faithfully obedient to God because life happens. Life has no guarantees. Every person can face difficulty. Even a person who is faithfully obedient to God can get sick, lose their job, get in a tragic accident, be misunderstood, mistreated, and will eventually die. That's humanity 101. But the principle David shares is still legit. The best way to live is the way of faithful obedience to God. That way of faithful obedience to God, it shows our gratitude and praise to God. The way of faithful obedience to God shows our trust in God. And the way of faithful obedience to God is not always easy. Remember last week, the principle that David gave us when he said, I will not sacrifice to God that which costs me nothing. When we give our lives in faithful obedience to God, we are giving our lives to God in the way of costly sacrifice. But we do so knowing that His way is the good way. His way, Jesus said, is the way of abundant life. And so we give generously to His kingdom through offerings. We give generously to His kingdom through volunteering our time. I'm convinced that giving our time to participate in worship services like this one is a great start. I'm also convinced we need to take the next step. Serving the mission of the kingdom. First, understanding what He means by the mission of His kingdom, and then taking steps to align our hearts and minds and actions with the way of His kingdom. So going to church worship services is a very good thing. I want more people to go to church worship services. And I want the people who do go to church worship services to go more frequently than they already do. But I also want all of us to participate in the mission of the kingdom. To reach out in love to the people in our community, to give them heaven. To love sacrificially and generously. To love as Jesus loves. And in that way, we can take David's last words and live them out in our own lives. So let's give him that.